The Quiet Traveler. Dr. Kenneth Rhodes adjusted his glasses as he walked down the jet bridge toward Flight 628, his leather duffel bag slung over one shoulder. At 62, Kenneth moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had seen much of the world and carried its lessons with quiet dignity. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his navy blazer well-tailored, and his polished shoes reflected the ambient lights of the airport. Yet beneath this composed exterior was a man who preferred solitude to small talk and observation to confrontation. As he stepped into the aircraft cabin, Kenneth's eyes instinctively scanned the faces of passengers and crew. The flight attendants, with their neatly pressed uniforms and bright smiles, stood at the front, welcoming passengers. Their demeanor was polite, yet Kenneth's trained eye picked up the subtle inconsistencies in their interactions. Some passengers received warmer greetings, a few were offered fleeting but genuine smiles, while others were met with a more transactional politeness. Kenneth knew better than to dwell on it. These nuances had become background noise to him, familiar, disappointing, and largely unchangeable. He found his seat, 12A, a window seat near the wing, and settled in. Placing his duffel bag under the seat, he smoothed the creases in his trousers and adjusted his blazer. He leaned back, glancing briefly out the window as the last passengers boarded. A woman in her early 30s with sleek black hair and a sharp business suit sat down across the aisle. Her movements were crisp and purposeful, the kind of person who exuded control and confidence. She placed her laptop bag beneath her seat and opened a folder, reviewing its contents with an intensity that matched her appearance. Kenneth noticed her, but only briefly, before returning his gaze to the window. As the cabin door closed and the safety announcements began, Kenneth's thoughts drifted. He was on his way to San Francisco to deliver a lecture on civil rights at a prominent university. It wasn't his first time speaking on the subject, but this invitation carried a special weight. He had been a quiet force in the movement decades ago, preferring to work behind the scenes rather than in the spotlight. Now, as a respected academic and mentor to many, he was finally stepping into a role that demanded more visibility. The plane taxied and then lifted off, climbing steadily through the thick layer of clouds before leveling out at cruising altitude. The hum of the engines became a steady backdrop to the soft murmurs of passengers and the faint clink of service carts being prepared in the galley. As the flight attendants began their service, Kenneth observed their interactions with the passengers ahead of him. The flight attendant assigned to his section, a young woman named Melissa, moved briskly, her polished smile firmly in place. Kenneth noticed how her demeanor shifted subtly from one passenger to the next. She lingered longer with certain passengers, her tone warmer and her smile brighter. With others, her interactions were efficient but devoid of any personal touch. Kenneth's attention returned to the window. He wasn't thirsty, but he decided he would ask for a glass of water when Melissa reached his row. It was a simple request, one he had made countless times before. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, allowing the steady hum of the engines to wash over him. When the cart finally reached Kenneth's row, he straightened slightly and made his request. "May I have a glass of water, please?" he asked, his voice calm and polite. Melissa hesitated, her pen hovering over her notepad. "Of course," she replied, her tone clipped, almost automatic. Without making eye contact, she moved the cart forward and continued to the next row. Kenneth watched her retreating figure, a faint sigh escaping his lips. He wasn't surprised, but there was a quiet weight to moments like these, a reminder of the invisible boundaries that still existed even in seemingly trivial interactions. Across the aisle, the woman in the business suit, who had been reviewing her documents, glanced up from her folder. Her sharp eyes had caught the brief exchange, and though she returned to her work, her brow furrowed slightly. She kept an eye on Kenneth and the flight attendant as the cart made its way to the back of the cabin. Minutes passed, but the water didn't come. Kenneth remained composed, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, his expression neutral. He had learned long ago that patience often yielded better results than confrontation, even if it meant waiting longer than necessary. The woman across the aisle, whose name was Rachel Collins, tapped her pen against her folder, her mind divided between her presentation and the interaction she had witnessed. She couldn't shake the feeling that the omission wasn't accidental, and the more she thought about it, the more it bothered her. The cart eventually returned, now collecting empty cups and wrappers. Kenneth raised a hand slightly as Melissa passed by. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I had asked for a glass of water earlier." Melissa blinked, as if the request had completely slipped her mind. "Oh, right," she said quickly, her tone rushed. "I'll get that for you." She moved on, but the water still didn't arrive. Rachel's irritation grew. She set her folder aside and leaned into the aisle, her voice cutting through the cabin noise. "Excuse me," she called to Melissa. Her tone was calm but firm, leaving no room for dismissal. "This gentleman has been waiting for a glass of water for quite some time. Is there a problem?" Melissa stopped, her smile faltering for a split second before returning, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I was just about to get it," she said, her tone defensive. "I see," Rachel replied, her gaze steady. "Then I'm sure it won't take much longer." Melissa nodded curtly and disappeared toward the galley. Kenneth turned to Rachel, his expression a mix of surprise and quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, his deep voice steady but tinged with weariness. "It's nothing," Rachel replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "You shouldn't have to keep asking." Kenneth offered a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sometimes you do," he said, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime of such moments. As the flight continued, Rachel couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. The incident wasn't just about water. It was about the subtle, persistent inequities that too often went unnoticed or unaddressed. She resolved not to let it slide. Not this time. A ripple in the calm. The cabin of Flight 628 hummed with a subdued rhythm, passengers engrossed in their books, devices, or quiet conversations. Yet Rachel Collins found herself unable to focus. The earlier interaction with the flight attendant had left a lingering tension in the air, one that gnawed at her sense of justice. Rachel, a sharp and seasoned litigator, was no stranger to confrontation. She had built her career fighting for those who often went unheard, and while this wasn't a courtroom, the principles remained the same. A small omission, like ignoring a passenger's request for water, might seem insignificant to some, but to Rachel, it was a reflection of something deeper, a symptom of indifference that she couldn't ignore. She stole a glance at Kenneth, who sat quietly by the window, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. He didn't seem outwardly upset, but there was a stillness about him, a kind of resigned calm that spoke volumes. Rachel had seen that same look on the faces of her clients, people who had endured years of subtle slights and quiet exclusions, learning to weather them with grace simply to avoid drawing more attention to themselves. Melissa, the flight attendant, reappeared from the galley, her posture straight and her expression carefully neutral. She carried a glass of water, which she placed on Kenneth's tray table without a word. Then, as if eager to put the matter behind her, she moved briskly to the next row, her smile returning as she engaged with another passenger. "Thank you," Kenneth said softly, though Melissa had already turned away. Rachel's gaze followed the flight attendant as she continued down the aisle, her demeanor warmer with others than it had been with Kenneth. Rachel felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't just the initial oversight that bothered her. It was the deliberate coolness with which the situation had been handled. She could feel the weight of unspoken judgments in the cabin, the way some passengers cast quick glances in her direction before returning to their own affairs. Rachel leaned slightly into the aisle, her sharp eyes scanning the faces around her. The middle-aged man across from her gave her a brief, disapproving look before turning back to his tablet. 2 rows behind her, a young woman whispered something to her companion, their muffled laughter blending into the background noise. It was subtle, but Rachel felt it, a quiet undercurrent of discomfort, as though her actions had disrupted the delicate balance of the flight. She sat back in her seat, exhaling softly. For a moment, she questioned herself. Had she overstepped? Was it worth speaking up over something as trivial as a glass of water? But then her thoughts returned to Kenneth, his calm, unflinching demeanor, and the way he had thanked her with a quiet sincerity that hinted at a lifetime of unspoken stories. Kenneth must have sensed her unease because he turned to her, offering a faint smile. "You've got a good heart," he said, his voice low and steady. Rachel raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a slight smirk. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "Maybe not," Kenneth replied, his tone thoughtful. "But I know when someone sees something wrong and decides to do something about it. That's not as common as it should be." Rachel leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest. "It just didn't sit right with me. You asked for water. It's not a big ask." Kenneth chuckled softly, a deep, resonant sound that carried both amusement and a touch of sadness. "In the grand scheme of things, it isn't. But sometimes, even small asks feel like mountains to climb." The plane hit a patch of turbulence, the cabin shaking lightly as the captain's voice came over the intercom to reassure passengers. Rachel glanced around, noting how quickly people adjusted, securing their belongings, tightening their seatbelts, and returning to their distractions. Life moved on, as it always did. But Rachel wasn't ready to let go. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, and turned to Kenneth again. "You didn't seem surprised," she said, her tone more serious now, "about how she treated you. Why is that?" Kenneth tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Because it's not new," he said simply. "When you've lived as long as I have, you start to notice patterns, little things that add up over time. You learn to pick your battles. And you didn't think this was a battle worth fighting?" Rachel asked, her brows furrowing. Kenneth's gaze shifted to the window, where the endless expanse of clouds stretched out like a soft, unbroken sea. "I've fought my share of battles," he said after a pause. "Sometimes you let the small things go so you can save your energy for the bigger ones." Rachel's jaw tightened, but letting it go doesn't make it right. "No, it doesn't," Kenneth agreed. "But it does make it easier to keep moving forward." Rachel fell silent, mulling over his words. She understood his perspective. Resilience often required compromise. But she also knew that silence, even in the face of small injustices, could be dangerous. It allowed the status quo to persist, unchecked and unchallenged. As the flight attendants continued their service, Rachel noticed Melissa glancing toward their row more frequently now, her movements more measured. It was as though she could feel the weight of Rachel's scrutiny and Kenneth's quiet dignity pressing against her carefully constructed professionalism. When Melissa passed by again, Rachel didn't hold back. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I'd like to speak to the lead flight attendant." Melissa froze, her smile faltering. "Is there an issue, ma'am?" she asked, her voice carrying a forced lightness. "There was," Rachel replied evenly. "And I'd like to address it properly." Melissa hesitated, her eyes darting briefly to Kenneth before nodding. "I'll let them know," she said, quickly retreating to the front of the cabin. Kenneth sighed softly, shaking his head. "You really don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Rachel said firmly. "If people don't speak up, nothing changes." Kenneth smiled faintly, a mix of admiration and resignation in his expression. "You remind me of my daughter," he said. "She's got that same fire in her." Rachel tilted her head. "She must have learned it from somewhere." Kenneth chuckled again, the sound softer this time. "Maybe, but she's taken it further than I ever did. She's a public defender in Chicago, fights tooth and nail for every case she gets. Makes me proud." "Sounds like you raised her right," Rachel said, a genuine smile tugging at her lips. Kenneth nodded, his gaze distant. "I tried. But life has a way of teaching its own lessons." Moments later, the lead flight attendant approached their row, her demeanor professional, but noticeably more attentive than Melissa's had been. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice warm. "I understand there was a concern raised earlier." I'd like to address it." Rachel straightened, meeting the woman's gaze. "Yes," she said calmly. "A passenger in this row made a simple request for water and was ignored multiple times. I don't believe it was an oversight." The lead attendant's smile tightened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I'm very sorry to hear that," she said. "We strive to provide equal service to all of our passengers. I'll speak with the crew member involved and ensure it doesn't happen again." Rachel nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. "Thank you. I hope you do." As the lead attendant retreated, Kenneth turned to Rachel, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" he asked quietly. Rachel leaned back, her gaze steady. "Maybe not today," she admitted. "But if enough people speak up, eventually, it has to." A web of observations. As the plane cruised through the steady blue expanse above the clouds, the cabin fell into a routine lull. Passengers occupied themselves with their chosen distractions, some scrolling on phones, others flipping through magazines or engrossed in in-flight entertainment. But the atmosphere was far from calm for Rachel Collins. The earlier confrontation with the flight attendants still buzzed in her thoughts like a static hum, unresolved and bothersome. She couldn't shake the way Melissa had carried herself, the stiff professionalism that bordered on indifference, or the subtle disdain that seemed to linger beneath her polished facade. It wasn't outright hostility, Rachel thought, but it was deliberate, and that made it all the more troubling. Her legal mind, trained to identify patterns and inconsistencies, couldn't help but analyze the situation. From her seat, Rachel watched the subtle choreography of the crew. Melissa moved through the aisle again, engaging with other passengers, her demeanor warmer now, even congenial. It wasn't just the interactions but the precision of her effort, measured, calculated, and given to some passengers more generously than others. The shift in her attitude was evident, and Rachel felt a surge of irritation. It was as if the earlier incident had made her more careful, but the underlying issue remained untouched. Rachel turned to glance at Kenneth, who had returned to gazing out the window. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem upset, but Rachel had the distinct impression that he was processing everything in his own quiet way. She wondered how many times he had endured similar moments, whether he'd learned to compartmentalize them, or if they left scars that never fully healed. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me." Rachel turned to see a young woman seated a row ahead, partially turned in her seat. Her large, dark eyes were filled with curiosity, and her hands nervously smoothed the edge of a bright yellow scarf draped around her shoulders. "I couldn't help but overhear earlier," the woman began, her voice hesitant but earnest. "What you said to the flight attendant. It was brave." Rachel blinked, caught off guard. "Brave," she repeated, her tone skeptical. "I just pointed out something that was wrong." The woman nodded quickly. "I know, but not everyone would. Most people would just let it go. I think it was important that you didn't." Rachel offered a faint smile, unsure how to respond. It felt like the right thing to do. The young woman's gaze shifted to Kenneth. "I noticed it too," she said, her voice softer now. "How they treated him. It wasn't right." Kenneth turned slightly, acknowledging the conversation with a gentle nod. "Thank you," he said, his tone calm and even. "But I'm used to it." The woman frowned, her hands clenching briefly before she released them. "You shouldn't have to be." Rachel leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "What's your name?" she asked, her tone warm but direct. "Layla," the woman replied. "Layla Hassan." "Well, Layla," Rachel said, her voice firm, "if you noticed it, others did too. And that's the problem. People see these things and choose to stay quiet. That's what allows it to keep happening." Layla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "But do you think speaking up really changes anything? It feels like, I don't know, like people are set in their ways." Kenneth, who had been silent, turned fully to face them. His deep voice cut through the hum of the cabin with quiet authority. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said. It happens in small steps, over time. And those steps start with moments like these. Rachel studied him for a moment, her respect for him growing. It's about accountability, she added, looking at Layla. When people know they're being watched, they're less likely to act on their biases. It doesn't fix the problem, but it's a start. Layla nodded again, her fingers tracing the edge of her scarf. I wish more people thought like that. As the conversation tapered off, Rachel leaned back in her seat, her mind still turning over the complexities of the situation. She couldn't help but notice how the dynamic in the cabin had shifted. Passengers who had initially ignored her, or Kenneth, were now casting furtive glances their way. Some seemed disapproving, others curious. A few even appeared supportive, their expressions subtle but unmistakable. A man seated diagonally behind Rachel, dressed in a rumpled polo shirt, leaned forward slightly. "I don't mean to interrupt," he said, his tone cautious, "but I couldn't help but hear what you were saying earlier." Rachel turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Go on." The man hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward Kenneth. Do you think it's possible that maybe it wasn't about, race? Maybe she was just having a bad day or something." Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line, her patience waning. "Do you think she treated anyone else like that?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled. "Because I didn't see it." The man held up his hands defensively. "I'm just saying, sometimes people see things that aren't there." Kenneth interjected before Rachel could respond, his voice calm but firm. "And sometimes people don't see things that are there because they don't want to." The man opened his mouth as if to argue, but then seemed to think better of it. He sat back in his seat, muttering something under his breath. Rachel exhaled, the tension in the cabin growing more palpable by the minute. She glanced at Kenneth, who gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to fight every battle," he said softly. "Yes, I do," Rachel replied, her voice unwavering. "Because if I don't, who will?" Kenneth's smile deepened, and there was something in his eyes, a mixture of pride and sadness, that struck Rachel deeply. She realized then that his calm demeanor wasn't just about endurance. It was about faith. Faith that someone, somewhere, would take up the fight, even when he was too tired to do so himself. In the galley, Melissa stood with another flight attendant, their voices low but animated. The lead attendant had joined them, her expression tight with disapproval. Rachel couldn't hear their words, but the glances they cast toward her row spoke volumes. Layla leaned closer to Rachel, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they're talking about us?" "I'd bet on it," Rachel replied, her tone dry. Kenneth chuckled softly, the sound warm despite the tension. "Let them talk," he said. "The truth has a way of finding its way through." Rachel smiled at him, her resolve hardening. "It always does," she said, "but sometimes it needs a little help." As the plane cruised on, the ripple of their actions continued to spread, touching passengers and crew alike in ways none of them fully realized yet. The quiet resistance, the hum of the engines had become a steady background note, an ever-present companion on this turbulent journey, not through the skies, but through the layers of unspoken tension unraveling inside the cabin. Rachel Collins leaned back in her seat, staring at the tray table in front of her, as though it held the answers to the questions spinning in her mind. Across the aisle, Kenneth Rhodes remained composed, his focus once again on the expanse of clouds outside. There was a peace to his demeanor, a kind of quiet endurance that only came from years of weathering storms. It frustrated Rachel, not because she doubted his strength, but because she knew he shouldn't have to rely on it so often. In the galley, Melissa stood with her back to the cabin, meticulously arranging cups and napkins on the service cart. Her motions were precise, almost mechanical, but her mind raced with the sting of earlier confrontations. She didn't like being called out, especially not in such a public way. It wasn't that she thought herself discriminatory. She prided herself on treating everyone equally, But Rachel's pointed remarks had forced her to confront something she hadn't considered. Maybe she hadn't been as impartial as she believed. Her colleague, Alex, a senior flight attendant with years of experience, joined her, sensing her agitation. "You okay?" he asked, his tone neutral but laced with curiosity. Melissa nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just a rough crowd today." Alex raised an eyebrow, glancing toward Kenneth and Rachel's row. "That the rough part?" he asked knowingly. Melissa hesitated, her hands pausing over the cart. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's just, I feel like they're making something out of nothing." Alex leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Maybe," he said carefully, "or maybe they see something you don't." Back in her seat, Rachel couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. Passengers glanced her way and then quickly looked away when she met their eyes. It wasn't outright hostility, but it wasn't support either. It was the kind of passive discomfort that comes from people being forced to confront something they'd rather ignore. Layla, seated ahead of her, turned around again, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her scarf. "Do you think they'll do anything about it?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. Rachel shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know," she admitted, "but that's not the point." Layla tilted her head. "Then what is?" Rachel leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "The point is making them think. Whether they act on it or not, they'll remember this moment. And maybe, next time, they'll act differently." Kenneth turned slightly, his gaze shifting between the two women. "You've got a lot of faith in people," he said, his tone carrying both admiration and skepticism. Rachel smiled faintly. "Not faith," she corrected. "Hope." The flight attendants resumed their rounds, their movements more deliberate now, as though aware that they were under scrutiny. Melissa avoided Kenneth's row entirely, leaving Alex to manage the service there. When he approached, his demeanor was noticeably warmer than Melissa's had been. "Sir," he said, addressing Kenneth directly, "is there anything else I can get for you?" Kenneth shook his head, offering a polite smile. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Alex nodded, his expression sincere. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Rachel observed the interaction, noting the contrast in tone and attentiveness. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She leaned back, letting out a slow breath. Progress, even if incremental, was still progress. But the cabin wasn't done responding. A man seated 2 rows ahead of Rachel turned in his seat, his voice low but pointed. "Some of us are just trying to enjoy the flight," he said, addressing no one in particular, but clearly intending for Rachel to hear. "Not everything has to be a crusade." Rachel straightened, her eyes narrowing. "You're right," she replied, her tone sharp. "Not everything has to be. But when it's staring you in the face, ignoring it is just as much of a choice." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "It's just water," he muttered, turning back to his seat. "Maybe to you," Rachel countered, her voice louder now. "But it's never just water. It's about respect. It's about being seen." Her words hung in the air, drawing the attention of more passengers. Kenneth shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting lightly on Rachel's arm. "Let it go," he murmured. "I can't," Rachel replied, her voice soft but resolute. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier, the tension palpable. Conversations died down, and even the hum of the engines seemed quieter. Rachel's heart raced, but she refused to back down. She knew that speaking up came with risks, but the alternative, silence, was unacceptable. Layla spoke up then, her voice hesitant but firm. "She's right," she said, addressing the passengers around her. "It's not just about the water. It's about how people are treated." Her words seemed to embolden others. A man seated behind Rachel, who had been silent until now, nodded. "I saw it too," he said. "It wasn't right." One by one, voices joined in, a ripple of agreement spreading through the cabin. It wasn't a tidal wave, but it was enough to shift the energy. Melissa, still in the galley, heard the murmurs and felt her stomach twist. She hadn't expected this. Kenneth watched the unfolding scene with a mix of emotions. He appreciated the solidarity, but he also felt the weight of being at the center of it. He leaned toward Rachel, his voice low and steady. "You've started something here," he said. Rachel met his gaze, her expression firm. "It's not just about starting it," she replied. "It's about finishing it." The lead flight attendant appeared again, her expression composed but her posture tense. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, addressing the cabin, "we understand there have been concerns raised during this flight. Please know that we take all feedback seriously and are committed to addressing any issues." Her words were polished, rehearsed, but they lacked the sincerity Rachel was looking for. Still, it was a step, a small acknowledgement that something had happened. Rachel turned to Kenneth, her expression softening. "Does that feel like enough to you?" she asked. Kenneth considered the question, his gaze thoughtful. "It's a start," he said, "but real change takes more than words." As the plane began its descent, the cabin slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But the undercurrent of change remained, subtle yet undeniable. For Rachel, Lila, and even Kenneth, the flight had become more than just a journey from one city to another. It had become a microcosm of the larger battles they all faced, a reminder that change, no matter how small, always began with someone willing to speak up. Ripples in the air. The plane descended gradually, the patchwork of earth below growing more defined. The hum of the engines, once a soothing constant, now felt like a low drumbeat underscoring the simmering tension in the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening seatbelts and packing away their belongings, but the atmosphere was far from settled. The earlier confrontation had left a mark, a ripple that had spread wider than anyone could have anticipated. Rachel Collins sat upright, her arms crossed as her sharp gaze swept the cabin. She noticed the way passengers avoided her eyes, their discomfort evident. Others met her gaze with subtle nods of approval, their expressions a mix of quiet support and relief. Across the aisle, Kenneth Rhodes remained composed, his demeanor calm but introspective. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, the only outward sign of the thoughts swirling in his mind. "Do you think they'll actually do anything about it?" Rachel asked quietly, glancing at Kenneth. He turned his head, offering her a faint smile. "Maybe," he said, "but real change doesn't happen because of one incident. It happens because people like you refuse to let things slide." Rachel tilted her head, studying him. "You've let things slide before, haven't you?" Kenneth's smile deepened, though it carried a hint of sadness. "More times than I can count. Sometimes you let things go because the fight feels too exhausting. Other times you let them go because you're not sure it'll make a difference." Rachel leaned forward, her tone firm. "But it does make a difference, Kenneth. Even if it's just one person thinking twice next time, that's something." Kenneth nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You remind me of my wife," he said, his voice soft. "She was always the one to speak up, to push back, to make people think. I guess I learned to save my energy for the moments that really mattered." Rachel's gaze softened. "And what do you think about this moment? Does it matter?" Kenneth looked around the cabin, his eyes lingering on the faces of passengers and crew alike. "It matters," he said finally, "because you've made people notice. Whether they like it or not, they've noticed." Layla Hassan, seated a row ahead, turned slightly to join the conversation. "You've definitely made an impression," she said, her voice tinged with nervous energy. "I've never seen anything like this on a flight before." Rachel smirked, a glimmer of humor breaking through her seriousness. "Neither have I, and I've been on a lot of flights." Layla hesitated, her fingers playing with the edge of her scarf. "Do you think it's enough? Just speaking up, I mean." Rachel shrugged. "It's a start. That's all it ever is. But it's better than staying silent." Kenneth leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Silence is the ally of complacency," he said. "Speaking up, even in small ways, disrupts that." Layla nodded, her expression thoughtful. I guess I'd always been afraid of speaking up. It feels risky. Rachel's expression softened. It is risky. But staying quiet comes with risks too. Risks we don't always see until it's too late. In the galley, Melissa stood with Alex, her senior colleague, her posture tense as she recounted the events of the flight. I just don't understand why it became such a big deal, she said, frustration lacing her tone. I forgot his water. I apologized. Why couldn't they just let it go? Alex crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Do you really think it was just about the water? He asked quietly. Melissa faltered, her brow furrowing. What else would it be about? Alex sighed, leaning against the counter. Melissa, you're good at your job, but sometimes we don't see our own blind spots. This isn't the first time someone's felt ignored or dismissed. And it's not just you. It's all of us. The way we interact with passengers, the little choices we make, they add up. Melissa frowned, her frustration giving way to a flicker of doubt. You think I was unfair? Alex met her gaze, his tone firm but kind. I think it's worth considering why they felt the way they did. And I think it's worth making sure no one feels that way again. As the plane began its final descent, the lead flight attendant made her way to Kenneth's row. Her polished demeanor remained intact, but there was a subtle shift in her tone, a hint of genuine effort beneath the professional facade. Mr. Rhodes, she said, addressing him directly, on behalf of the crew, I want to apologize for the earlier oversight. It was unintentional, but that doesn't make it acceptable. We'll be addressing this internally to ensure it doesn't happen again. Kenneth inclined his head, his voice calm. Thank you. I appreciate that. Rachel, seated beside him, studied the attendant closely. She noted the tension in her posture, the slight hesitation in her words. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a step in the right direction. As the attendant turned to leave, Rachel leaned toward Kenneth. Do you believe her? She asked. Kenneth's lips curved into a faint smile. I believe she means well, he said. Whether it changes anything, only time will tell. The plane touched down smoothly, the familiar jolt of the landing gear sparking a ripple of relief through the cabin. Passengers began gathering their belongings, the hum of conversation growing louder. But the tension of the earlier events lingered, a quiet undercurrent that couldn't be ignored. As the passengers disembarked, Rachel walked beside Kenneth, Layla trailing just behind. They passed Melissa, who stood near the exit, her smile tight, but her eyes avoiding theirs. Rachel stopped briefly, meeting Melissa's gaze. For what it's worth, Rachel said, her tone measured, I hope you think about today. Melissa blinked, her expression faltering. I will, she said softly. Rachel nodded, her own expression unreadable. Good. As they stepped into the terminal, Kenneth turned to Rachel, his voice carrying a note of gratitude. Thank you, he said simply. Rachel waved him off. You don't need to thank me. This isn't over, not by a long shot. Kenneth chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. No, it isn't, but you've made a difference today. Rachel smiled faintly, her gaze distant. We all did. Layla, standing beside them, nodded. I'll remember this, she said. And next time, I'll speak up too. Rachel glanced at her, a spark of pride in her eyes. Good, she said. That's how it starts. As they parted ways, Rachel watched Kenneth disappear into the crowd, his quiet strength leaving a lasting impression. She turned toward her own gate, her thoughts buzzing with the events of the flight. It wasn't just about one glass of water, one slight, or one confrontation. It was about the ripples those moments created, the quiet resistance that could, over time, change the course of a much larger tide. The aftermath of awareness. The soft hum of the airport terminal was a stark contrast to the tension that had permeated the cabin of Flight 628. Rachel Collins walked toward the baggage claim, her heels clicking sharply against the polished tile floor. Though the confrontation was behind her, it lingered in her mind, replaying like a courtroom scene she couldn't quite leave behind. Kenneth Rhodes had taken a different path, his steady gait disappearing into the crowd as he headed toward his connecting flight. He had thanked her, and while his gratitude felt sincere, Rachel couldn't shake the weight of his words. "You've made a difference today." Had she? And if so, how much? Chance encounter. As Rachel waited for her bag, she saw a familiar figure approach. Layla Hassan, the young woman with the vibrant scarf, waved hesitantly before stepping closer. "Hey," Layla said, her voice carrying a mixture of nerves and determination. "I just wanted to say, thank you for what you did back there." Rachel tilted her head, offering a faint smile. "You don't need to thank me, Layla. I just spoke up." "But you didn't have to," Layla countered, her voice firmer now. "A lot of people wouldn't have." Rachel studied her for a moment, noting the fire that had begun to ignite in the younger woman's eyes. "And now," Rachel asked, "what do you think you'll do next time?" Layla straightened her posture, the edge of her scarf catching the light. "I won't stay quiet," she said, her tone resolute. "Not anymore." Rachel nodded, her smile widening. "Good. That's how change starts. One person at a time." Layla lingered for a moment before excusing herself, her steps more confident as she disappeared into the crowd. Watching her go, Rachel felt a small surge of pride. Maybe the flight had been more than a disruption. Maybe it had planted seeds that would grow into something larger. The crew confrontation. Meanwhile, in the crew lounge, Melissa sat at a round table, her posture stiff as Alex and the lead flight attendant, Janet, discussed the events of the flight. The room was quiet except for their low voices and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. "It wasn't intentional," Melissa said, her tone defensive. "I didn't ignore him on purpose." Janet crossed her arms, her expression stern but not unkind. "Maybe not," she said, "but the perception matters just as much as the intent." He felt dismissed, and so did the passengers who witnessed it. Melissa looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her name tag. I didn't think it would come across like that." Alex leaned forward, his tone gentler. "That's the point, Melissa. These things are subtle, but they add up. It's not about a glass of water. It's about how people feel when they interact with us. You have to be more aware of those dynamics." Melissa nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "So, what do I do now?" Janet softened, placing a hand on Melissa's shoulder. "You learn. You grow. And next time, you make sure no one feels invisible." The unexpected impact. Back at the baggage claim, Rachel spotted Kenneth again. He stood off to the side, his Panama hat tilted slightly as he scanned the carousel. She approached him, her steps hesitant but purposeful. "Didn't expect to see you again," Rachel said with a small smile. Kenneth turned, his expression lighting up. "Neither did I. I thought you'd be halfway to your next fight by now." Rachel chuckled softly. "I'm not always fighting. Sometimes, I just think." Kenneth's gaze turned thoughtful. "And what are you thinking about now?" Rachel hesitated, then gestured vaguely around them. "How small actions can ripple out. I mean, what happened on that flight? It wasn't huge, but it felt important." Kenneth nodded, his expression warm. It was important. Not because it solved anything, but because it made people pay attention. That's the first step to change. Rachel studied him, a sense of calm settling over her. "You seem so sure." Kenneth smiled faintly. "I've lived long enough to know that the world doesn't change overnight. But I also seen how one moment can inspire another, and another after that. You might not see the impact right away, but it's there." The ripples spread. Elsewhere in the terminal, Layla sat at a cafe table, scrolling through her phone. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen before typing out a post. Her words were brief but powerful. "Today, I saw someone stand up for what was right. It reminded me that silence isn't always the answer. We can all do better." She hit post and watched as the likes and comments began to trickle in. Some agreed with her, others questioned her perspective, but all of them were engaging with the idea. It was a small step, but it felt meaningful. The reflection. As Rachel and Kenneth parted ways once more, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because she had won anything, but because she had made people think. Kenneth's quiet strength and Layla's newfound resolve gave her hope that the ripples from their flight would continue to spread. Kenneth, for his part, felt lighter than he had in a long time. Rachel's determination had reminded him of something he'd nearly forgotten. The power of speaking up, even in small ways. He resolved to carry that lesson forward, not just for himself, but for the next generation watching him. As the two walked their separate paths, the echoes of their actions lingered, not just in their lives, but in the lives of everyone who had witnessed their quiet resistance. In the end, it wasn't just about a glass of water. It was about dignity, respect, and the simple but profound act of being seen. The closing chapter. Rachel found her suitcase on the carousel and pulled it off with a smooth, practiced motion. She glanced one last time in the direction where Kenneth had disappeared, the Panama hat a marker of his understated presence. She smiled faintly to herself, reflecting on the profound grace he had carried, even under the weight of invisible injustices. As she turned to leave the baggage area, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Layla. "Thank you again for what you did today. You've inspired me. Let's keep in touch." Rachel smiled, typing back a quick response. "You've got this, Layla. Speak up when it matters. You'll inspire others too." Sliding her phone into her pocket, Rachel walked out into the crisp air of the arrivals terminal, her thoughts lighter than before. The day's events had reminded her why she fought so hard in the courtroom, and why she would never stop fighting outside of it. Moments like these didn't just define others, they shaped her too. Kenneth's journey. Kenneth walked through the bustling terminal, his leather satchel swinging gently at his side. The conversation with Rachel had left an indelible mark on him. Her fierce determination, combined with her unwavering sense of justice, had stirred something inside him, a memory of the idealism he carried in his youth. As he found his gate for the connecting flight, Kenneth pulled out his phone and dialed a number. His grandson's voice answered almost immediately. "Grandpa," came the enthusiastic greeting. "You're almost here." Kenneth smiled, his voice warm. "I am. But I wanted to tell you something before I get there." "Sure," his grandson said. "What's up?" Kenneth paused, his gaze drifting to the planes outside the terminal window. "You know how you've always said I should share my stories more, that I should speak up about the things I've seen." "Yeah," his grandson replied, his tone cautious but encouraging. "I think you're right," Kenneth said. "I think it's time." Layla's resolve. Layla stepped into a cab, her phone buzzing with notifications. Her post about the flight was gaining traction, and she could feel a mix of pride and nervousness as the comments poured in. Some were supportive, others dismissive, but all of them were engaging with the idea she had put forward. As the cab merged into traffic, she opened her notes app and began typing. The words came quickly, fueled by the emotions of the day. She didn't know where they would lead, but she knew she had something to say, something she could no longer keep to herself. Sometimes, the smallest actions spark the biggest changes. Today, I saw someone stand up, and it made me realize I have a voice too. It's time to use it. Melissa's reflection. In the quiet solitude of her hotel room that evening, Melissa sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the reflection in the mirror. The events of the flight played over in her mind. The moment she had hesitated with Kenneth, the curt responses, the pointed looks from Rachel. She sighed, pulling out a notebook she used for personal reflections. Flipping to a blank page, she wrote a single question at the top. What could I have done differently? As the words began to flow, Melissa felt a weight lifting. She realized that the confrontation, uncomfortable as it had been, was an opportunity for growth. She made a promise to herself that night, to be more mindful, to listen, and to ensure every passenger felt seen and valued, no matter how busy or distracted she was. The enduring ripples. In the days that followed, the events of Flight 628 became more than just a memory for those involved. Rachel returned to her legal work with renewed vigor, finding ways to incorporate her experience into her advocacy. Kenneth began writing down his stories, sharing them first with his grandson and then with larger audiences, inspiring others with his quiet resilience. Layla, emboldened by the day, started a blog about speaking up against everyday injustices, her voice growing louder with each post. Even Melissa, the flight attendant who had been the catalyst for the day's tension, carried the lessons forward. She began to notice the subtleties in her own behavior and worked to ensure her interactions were equitable and sincere. Over time, her efforts earned her recognition from colleagues and passengers alike. The ripples from that flight spread further than anyone could have imagined, touching lives in unexpected ways. They served as a reminder that change often begins with small moments. Moments of courage, moments of discomfort, and moments of connection. And as each person carried the lessons forward, the legacy of that quiet resistance lived on, shaping a world that was just a little bit brighter, one act of kindness and courage at a time.